Export it to the cloud, which we can all thank Union College for this.
Oh, good. Well, thank you,
Okay,
Union College. Great. So
there you
I
go.
guess it's okay because Dave and Linda have seen this before, so the beginning hasn't changed. So should I just start out?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So just as a background, now I originally made this presentation for my local genealogical society in the seminar, and the theme was uh, family stories, truth or fiction. So the idea was is to take a family story and see if it's really true or not. So in this case, the story is whatever happened to Uncle Roger. He went to New York City and disappeared. And here are two of the clues that I found that helped me to figure it out. And on the left, it's a um, accounting notebook from 90 years ago. And on the right is, of all things, Lowell Thomas, who was a famous radio broadcaster in the 1930s. So what do those have to do with Uncle Roger? Well, we're going to find out. Why is this not working? Here we go. Okay, good. So here's Uncle Roger Davidson's story. So here's the story as told to me by my mother, Aunt Jody. Whatever happened to Uncle Roger? He went to New York City and disappeared. The family tried to get in contact with Roger for years, but couldn't find out where he was or what happened to him. They tried really hard to find him. He may have committed suicide, jumped out a hotel window. So this was told by Jody Davidson Appel in 2021. So Roger Bernie Davidson was my great uncle. He's my grandfather, Carl S. Davidson's younger brother. The story was told by my mother, Jody Davidson Appel, and she was thrilled that I developed an interest in genealogy. One of the things she suggested was you should look into Uncle Roger. She was very enthusiastic about all this. So here's my mother and my father on the year that they were married. So my mother, Josephine Schmidt, married my father, David McClellan Davidson, in York, Pennsylvania in 1948. So my father was Roger's nephew. So the story about Roger would have come from him. Now here's where we fit into the family. So McClellan Davidson, it's really a pretty simple family tree for the Davidsons. McClellan Davidson is our great grandfather, and he had two sons. One is Carl Schaefer Davidson, CSD, who started the CS Davidson Incorporated, and then his younger brother, Roger Bernie Davidson, who's the subject that we're talking about. And of course, my father and my uncle Byard are the two sons that were children of Carl Schaefer Davidson. So there were two generations where the family had two boys. So here's Roger's journey. And one of the reasons why it resonated with me is because he had a similar life to mine. So Roger and Carl Davidson grew up in Hanover, Pennsylvania. Carl and our side of the Davidson family moved to nearby York, Pennsylvania, while Roger went to the big city. Manhattan is just a few hours away, but it's a world apart from South Central Pennsylvania. Roger's journey from Pennsylvania to New York in 1920 resonates with me as I made the same move in my 20s 60 years later. Now it's really kind of sad. The Davidson family has very little information. We don't have photographs, we don't have pictures, we don't have documents, anything. So we have no photos of Roger, but he likely looked a lot like his father, McClellan Davidson, and older brother, Carl S. Davidson. So here's my grandfather and great grandfather on the left at their business in Hanover. And on the right, there's Carl Davidson in college in 1914. He would have been about 25 years old, I think, at that time. So much of the mystery of Roger's disappearance is that his brother Carl Davidson was such a solid character, a real pillar of the community. So as we know, Carl founded CS Davidson Incorporated in York, Pennsylvania in 1923, a civil engineering firm that's still going strong over 100 years later. So, I mean, look at him. He just looks like such a solid, reliable character. And my father worked his entire career for CS Davidson Incorporated. CSD has provided a livelihood for three generations of the Davidson family. My brother David M. Davidson Jr. giving a speech at CS Davidson's 100th anniversary in 2023. He also spent his career at CS Davidson, and CSD is still a very significant employer in York, Pennsylvania. So that same month, we also celebrated my mother's 100th birthday. Now, here's the Davidson H&C Company in Hanover, PA. So Roger's father, McClellan Davidson, who's seated, founded the Davidson Heating and Contracting Company in Hanover. And the Davidson H&C Company is also still in business 120 years later. Now, I love this picture. If you look at them, you can just see they're happy to be there. They're proud. They're motivated. It just looks like, a nice place to work. These are people that enjoy being with each other. And I really treasure this photo of him and my grandfather. So as you can see, Uncle Roger's story doesn't seem to make a lot of sense because, the Davidson family that I know is all, pretty solid and reliable civil engineers and businessmen. I mean, I'm a Davidson, so I can say it, but the fact is the Davidson side of the family is pretty boring compared to the other sides of the family. So who would imagine that a Davidson relative would go to New York City and disappear or jump out a hotel window? So the story sounded so crazy that I immediately wrote it down and I dated it. So as soon as my mother told me the story, I wrote it down verbatim and I wrote down the date that she told me because it just sounded so completely crazy. So again, Roger's a complete blank slate. I know nothing. You know what I know about Roger Davidson when I started this investigation. So, there's no family information about him at all. So we have to reconstruct his life from publicly available information. So Roger Bernie Davidson, excuse me, was born in Taneytown in 1891, which is a very small town in Western Maryland. Now, the Davidson family came to the U.S. from Ireland in around 1825 and landed in Taneytown and stayed there for 80 years. Yeah, you can see Westminster, where our grandmother is from, is nearby. Roger was named after a family friend, Roger Burney, who taught a school for boys in many years. So I think, Roger Burney basically was, the schoolmaster for the town. So in 1895, the Davidson family moved 15 miles north to Hanover, Pennsylvania. Roger was 4 years old. So, though still small, Hanover was a much bigger town and likely afforded better opportunities. So you can see Hanover had over 10 times the population of Taneytown, which had under 600 people. Now, Hanover, Pennsylvania, as you might know, is the snack food capital of the world, which is great. So you've got Utz potato chips, you've got Snyder's old-time pretzels. It's a neat little town. It's a prosperous little place. It's now has 16,000 people, and it's in the southwest corner of York County in south central Pennsylvania. So, just following Roger's life, here we have the 1900 census that has the Davidson family living on Eichelberger Street in Hanover, PA. So the household included Roger's father, McClellan, his wife, Anna, and their two sons, Carl, who was 11, and Roger, 8, who were both at school. And McClellan Davidson was listed his profession as being a steam pipe fitter. In 1901, the next year, McClellan Davidson started the Davidson H&C Company. A charter granted the Davidson Heating and Construction Company was entered for the record yesterday. The business of the company is to be transacted in Hanover. It's still going. So here's the first thing I found about Roger, and I'm a little superstitious, but it just seems like he's kind of born under a bad sign. So Roger Davidson is suffering from a sore foot as a result of tramping on a nail while the lad was alighting from a train. So, I mean, that's just bad luck. The poor kid, he steps off a train and steps onto a nail and it goes through his foot. He would have been 17 years old at the time. Let me hear. Okay, so by the 1910 census, Roger was the only son in the Davidson household as Carl was away at college. Actually, Carl Davidson was the first member of the Davidson family to go to college. And to the question of attended any school anytime since September 1909, Roger answered no. So Roger was 19 years old at this time. He's listed as a steam pipe fitter, like his dad. So very likely he was working for his father in the Davidson heating and contracting business and still living at home. So here's Roger in 1913, and it seems that Roger married very well. Roger Davidson married Ava Edna Miller in 1913. They were both 22 years old. Ava appears to have been a very capable woman from a prominent local family. Her father owned a cigar factory in McSherrystown, which is a small suburb of Hanover. It was a modest wedding with Roger and his bride electing to live in Hanover. Now, here's more bad luck with poor Roger. So here we are in 1915, and he's bankrupt. So just in 1915, just 2 years after his marriage to Ava, the local papers reported that Roger and his National Novelty Works of Hanover had gone bankrupt. And Roger was personally liable for the debts of the company. He was 24 years old. So obviously, Roger had the entrepreneurial instincts of his father and brother, but met with less success than they did. Now, I just want to kind of focus on this for a second because, I mean, this guy's 24 years old and he's already bought a company and had it go bad. And, there's a lot of reasons why companies go bankrupt, and it's not always the fault of the person that buys it. So he's somebody that's in a hurry to succeed, I would say. I think he has a lot of ambition. So in 1917, and again, these are all newspaper articles that I found that um, give you some indication about what's going on in Roger's life. So in this case, his mother, my great grandmother, passed away in 1917, and her obituary has her son, 26-year-old son Roger, living in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So my great grandfather, McClellan Davidson, outlived his wife Anna by 34 years. 1917, this is Roger's draft registration card, and it has him having an injury at work. So Roger's military draft registration card shows him employed as a munitions inspector for the Harrisburg Pipe and Pipe Bending Company. He was 26 years old and still married to Ava. Roger claimed a disability exemption from the draft for a rupture working in a shell plant, which might have been more bad luck or possibly an attempt to avoid the draft. Apparently, it wasn't enough as he joined the Navy in August 1918. So here's a few thoughts about Roger. So even from what little information we have, we can make some general observations about him. So Roger was resilient. Now, just remember, he had his bankruptcy 2 years before, and here he's moving to a new, much larger city. Harrisburg's a much bigger place, and landing a good job as a munitions inspector. So Roger had ambition. He could have stayed in Hanover and just worked for his dad, but he didn't. And I think Roger may have sought exemption from military service in order to focus on his career. Now, the same report also gives us the only physical description we have of Roger. So it says that he is of medium height and slender build and has brown hair and blue eyes. So he has the characteristic Davidson family light blue eyes, which Roger shared. So Roger was probably a good-looking young man like his brother C.S. Davidson. And here we are with Roger. He's in the Navy. So this is his information on his time in the Navy. He was based in Lewis, Delaware, which I think most of us know. And he was active until January 1919 with an honorable discharge in September 1921. Roger did not deploy overseas, and he saw no action in World War I. So a very uneventful time in the Navy for Roger. So as far as we know, so here we are in 1920. Roger and Ava are 29 years old. So it looks like Roger and Ava went to New York City sometime around 1920 after he left the Navy. Now, there's no listing for Roger or Ava in the 1920 census, which might be that maybe they're in the midst of traveling, to New York City. Ava worked in women's retailing, and we're not sure what happened to Roger other than by 1928, he had left Ava in New York. So I spent a lot of time looking for anything I could find about Roger Davidson in New York City, and I couldn't find a thing. It was very frustrating. So let's step back and take a look at Roger's life. It's kind of amazing. You know, he keeps moving from these small rural towns in Pennsylvania to bigger and bigger cities. So Tawny Town's 566 people, Hanover's 10 times as big, Harrisburg's 10 times bigger than that, and New York City with 5,600,000 people is 100 times bigger than Harrisburg. So, obviously he's moving up in the world to bigger and bigger places. And Roger's timing was good. He arrived in New York City at the start of the Roaring Twenties. So what happened to Roger in New York? Okay, now this is interesting. Now this is some genealogical kind of information that I didn't realize. So I found two different, you know, local newspaper notices about Roger and actually his wife. Um, And one is that Mrs. Roger Davidson is visiting her parents, which is no big deal. That happened in August 1925. And then the next year, Mrs. Roger Davidson's mother passed away. Um, but the difference is that in 1925, she was referred to as Mrs. Roger Davidson of New York City. However, year later, when her mother died, Ava was described as Mrs. Ava M. Davidson, New York, and there is no mention of Roger in the obituary. Now, Ava's two married sisters were both referred to by their husbands' first names, Mrs. Elmer Slentz and Mrs. John A. Kinnaman. So, in social news reporting, this method of referring to the wife by her own name indicated marital estrangement. So it looks like 1926 was the year that they split up. Now, here's something completely out of left field. So in 1928, you've got this little notice in the Hanover Sun that Roger is living in Wheeling, West Virginia. So, and I'll just read it. Roger Davidson, Wheeling, West Virginia, who was operated upon at the Hanover General Hospital Wednesday, is reporting to be improving nicely. So, I mean, what the heck? I mean, what was Roger doing in Wheeling, West Virginia, and what was wrong with him that he had to get an operation? Why did he come back to Hanover for the operation? He could have stayed in Wheeling. And where was Ava? So again, it appears that Roger had health problems throughout his life. I mean, more bad luck. And it also breaks Roger's pattern. This is the first time he left a big city for a smaller town. Now, we don't know why Roger returned to Hanover he may have returned maybe to get help paying for his hospital stay, or, maybe just because his father was his closest living relative and he just wanted to be, with somebody while he was recuperating. So the 1930 census confirms what we found before is that Roger and Ava are living apart. So Mrs. Ava M. Davidson was single and living alone in New York City in the 1930 census. Ava did not answer the question, age at first marriage. So she's trying to even deny that she was married. Now, Ava was renting an apartment at West 104th Street, which you can see here, and working as a store manager for ladies' wear. So she definitely did not follow Roger to West Virginia. And in 1930, here's Roger still in West Virginia, and he's looking kind of downwardly mobile, Roger is. So Roger's now 38 years old. He's still living in Wheeling, West Virginia. He's listed as a roomer and a sign painter. So I would say that living in a rooming house and painting signs seems a definite drop in status from his profession as a munitions inspector 12 years before. So Roger wasn't thriving, but it might be due to the economic downturn. I mean, the entire United States was not thriving in 1930. So I think we kind of have to be fair to Roger. So Roger lists his marital condition as widowed, which is a surprise. So both Roger and Ava tried to hide their marriage. Oddly, Roger is living with a Minerva Davidson who owns the house and is the head of household. So he's a roomer in a rooming house that's owned by a Davidson. So what's that all about? So I spent some time trying to find out about Minerva Davidson. So Roger's landlady in the census. So she's 58 years old. So she's 20 years older than Roger. So her deceased husband, William Davidson, lived in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and he doesn't appear to be related to our side of the Davidson family at all, who are all from Maryland. So maybe the Davidson surname was just a coincidence. If she was a relative, she was a very distant one. I mean, she would have been like, the second cousin, the widow of the second cousin. So that's pretty distant relative. But even so, if she was a distant relative, it might be one reason why Roger moved to Wheeling. Now, let's check in on Ava in 1930. Now, Roger's struggling in Wheeling, West Virginia, but Ava was living large in New York. So she splurged by hiring a private plane to fly home for Christmas. The family of Charles E. Miller, McSherrystown, enjoyed a novel Christmas treat when his daughter, Mrs. Ava Davidson, flew over from New York to eat her Christmas dinner at home. And Ava's flying high. Look at this. So the huge red Balanca airplane with its deep-throated zoom attracted much attention as it passed over Hanover, treating Ava's sister, Miss Irene Miller, to a number of loops and spirals. So Ava and Irene were best friends all their life, the two sisters. Ava flew back to New York the next day, dropping off her other two sisters in Philadelphia on the way back. And I talked to people who are in the aviation industry, and they confirm this is a huge expense. I mean, this is like a huge splurge for somebody to do this. Ava was doing very well. So let's take a pause here and look at Roger's story. So I have to say that up until 1930, the family story about Roger doesn't make any sense at all. Roger had already come and gone to New York City, and he didn't disappear. His father knew he lived in Wheeling, and the census report proved it. So Roger wasn't hiding from anybody, and there's no indication that Roger tried to commit suicide. So maybe the story was false, or maybe the story was misremembered. My father passed away 50 years ago. The story's from him, and he probably told my mother the story decades before that. So maybe my mother, could my mother really accurately recall a story from 70 years ago? Okay, so the next step is I went off to Hanover, Pennsylvania. So I was back visiting in March 2022, and at the then 98-year-old mother's suggestion, I contacted the owners of Davidson H&C Company in Hanover, PA. So mother said they might have some information on the Davidson family. Hanover is a 40-minute drive from my mother's home in York. So here's the Davidson H&C Company. This is a picture from the 50s. The Bechtel family have owned and run the business in Hanover for 50 years. It's still in operation after 120, actually now 125 years. It's been in the same building since the 1950s. And I was the first Davidson to visit the company in decades. I think actually the first one to visit the company in half a century. And here we are at the Davidson H&C Company. And from the Davidson H&C website, the Bechtel family took over the company in 1952. They are currently operating under management by the fourth generation, with even the fifth generation of Bechtels working summers now too. So here we are. The Bechtel family were incredibly gracious and helpful. They had a number of items proudly on display from my great-grandfather's time over a century ago. So look at this. They have all the stuff that's on the wall, about the water heater business, boiler repairing compounds. Very interesting stuff. It's really, I mean, it's kind of like going back into a museum because they just kept such good care of everything. So I did not realize that my great-grandfather, McClellan Davidson, held a number of patents on heating equipment. The Bechtels kept the flasks that he used to mix chemicals for cleaning heating systems. And you can see that the flasks are still there. They still had my grandfather, C.S. Davidson's name cards from the 1950s, so he was involved in the business too. So it's just a wonderful visit with them. So it's wonderful that the Bechtel family kept such good care of the business for 70 years. Well, really, 125 years. So I asked, why did they keep the Davidson name? And what they said was McClellan Davidson had such a great reputation and was so trusted in town that we never considered changing the name. So it's just really sweet people and really nice, and they couldn't have been more gracious when I went to visit them. And you can see, they even have the neon sign, Davidson up there on the upper left. So they gave me a number of things. They gave me a box of McClellan Davidson's belongings, including his accounting notebooks from 90 years ago. So McClellan Davidson kept detailed records that show that he paid for an RBD at the Central Hotel in Hanover. That would be Roger Bernie Davidson. So you can see on the left there, it's got RBD and MCD, which is McClellan Davidson himself. So from 1932 to 1933 in Hanover, Roger was at the Central Hotel. So we know where he was during this period of time. So Roger stayed at the Central Hotel for 8 months from June 25th, 1932 to February 25th, 1933. Roger was 42 years old. McClellan Davidson paid for Roger's room and board, which is probably why he wrote it all down in his accounting notebook. So the Bechtels were mystified by this, and I agree with them. They thought it was a great mystery that McClellan Davidson had a son who his father paid everything for. So why did he do that? So here's what I think is the current Central Hotel in Hanover, Pennsylvania. So why did Uncle Roger need to have everything paid for him? So, let's be fair, excuse me, to Uncle Roger. It was the Great Depression, so pretty much everybody was short of money. But McClellan Davidson owned a contracting company and he wanted to help Roger. Why didn't he just hire Roger to work at Davidson H&C? So maybe Roger needed some kind of specialized skill to work there, or could there be some other explanation? Okay, now here's another little item that I found kind of later on in my search. I'll just read it. Roger Davidson of Hanover was fined $10 at a hearing in police court Friday on charges of drunkenness and disorderly conduct. He had been taken into custody at noon Thursday. So this is in New Oxford, PA. So you think Hanover is small. New Oxford, PA is a very small town, 6 miles away from Hanover. So it'd be very unusual to be drunk at noon on a Thursday. And we know from this that Roger spent the night in jail. So Roger's stay at the Central Hotel in Hanover had just ended a few weeks before. $10 would have paid for more than a week's lodging there. So, luckily this is a brief note in the back pages of a small town newspaper, so not many people would have seen it. But I have to say, it's not a good look for Roger. Okay, at this point, I'd kind of run out of things that I could find out about Roger. So I checked with artificial intelligence, in this case, Grok, to see if I'd missed anything about Roger. In fact, I fed the last story that we just read here. I said, can you find me anything else like this? So the response gave me a clue that helped me find the following story. A 9-story plunge from a New York City hotel. Now, here we have Lowell Thomas, who was a very famous radio broadcaster in the 30s and 40s. So in June 1933, just 4 months after Roger left Hanover, radio broadcaster Lowell Thomas reported the following story to his millions of listeners. And here it is verbatim. There's quite a bit of excitement on Broadway, New York this morning. A gentleman from Hanover, Pennsylvania fell out of the 9th story of his room in a hotel. He went down, bumping and bouncing on one awning after another. As he bounced, he naturally attracted the attention of numerous other guests in the hotel who started bombarding the front desk with telephone inquiries. On the first floor of that hotel, there is an extension which reached over the pavement, and it was there that the fallen gentleman finally landed. The point of the story is that he's still alive to tell the tale. Those awnings work like a series of circus nets. Horrified employees of the hotel rushed to the spot expecting to pick him up with a spoon. Instead of that, they found him sitting up, apparently quite uninjured, but a trifle dazed. His first remark was, "I seem to have taken a fall. Whoopee!" Them was his words. However, they had to take him to the hospital, but it was not on account of any broken bones. The hospital they took him to was the alcoholic DT ward at Bellevue. When he gets back to Hanover, Pennsylvania, he'll have quite a tale to tell the boys, and so long until Monday. It was Roger, obviously. So here's the follow-up article in the local Hanover newspapers. It must have been a huge splash in Hanover in 1933. So the 9-story plunge of a man believed to be Roger B. Davidson, Hanover, from a Midtown New York hotel and his miraculous escape from death was commented upon by Lowell Thomas. McClellan Davidson, father of Roger B. Davidson, has received no word today from the Bellevue Hospital where the fall victim, suffering only from a bump on the head, was a patient. Poor McClellan Davidson. Here he just finished putting up Roger for 8 months, trying to help him get him back on the feet. And now just 4 months later, this happens. Okay, so here's a few thoughts about the 9-story plunge. So these two stories, the New Oxford and the Lowell Thomas stories, explain a lot. Roger had a drinking problem. That could also explain the unfortunate pattern of injuries, bad health, and accidents that plagued Roger throughout his life, and why his father couldn't hire him. McClellan Davidson probably put Roger up at the Central Hotel in Hanover to get him off of alcohol. And you think about Roger McClellan. I mean, McClellan's an engineer, and his whole thing as an engineer is to fix problems. So here his son has a problem. He wants to fix the problem. And he was doing the right thing. So what was Roger doing in Midtown New York in 1933? Well, if he's trying to get back and reconcile with Ava, probably wasn't going well, especially after being described as a drunk on a national radio broadcast. And the family story was true. Roger did jump out of a hotel window. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the rest of Roger's life after this. So here we have Roger in 1934, and this is his application for veterans compensation. So the Lowell Thomas story was funny, but there's nothing funny about alcoholism. Roger's life was on a downward spiral. So the rest of his life, he lived at hotels or had no address whatsoever. Records show that Roger applied for veterans comp on November 6, 1934, at which time he gave his address as the Davis Hotel in Miami, Florida. Now, the reason he applied for veterans comp was lack of funds, so he had no money. Roger listed his wife, Ava Davidson of New York City, as a wife independent with no children. He was 43 years old. So what was Roger doing in Florida in November? So my guess is he went there for seasonal work in cold weather. And here's the end in 1936, 2 telegrams. So Roger died August 24, 1936 in St. Vincent's Hospital in Erie, Pennsylvania. His death was reported in New York, Pennsylvania newspapers. Excuse me, 2 telegrams were received by McClellan Davidson at the same time this morning. The one stating that his son was seriously ill from a gland infection, and the other stating that he had died. Mr. Davidson, that is Roger, was aged about 45 years. So this was the only published obituary that I found for Roger. It was in the York Gazette and Daily. And here's Roger's death certificate. So his death certificate stated that he died of Ludwig angina, which is an infection caused by an ulcerated tooth. And the certificate lists his last place of contact as Harbor Creek, which is a small rural area outside of Erie, Pennsylvania. There's no address listed for Roger. Now, Harbor Creek and that whole area was a center for fruit farming and was host to seasonal workers that came to pick the fruit. So again, my guess is that Roger was a seasonal worker just doing basically farm labor jobs, and that's what he was doing there in August of 1936 when he passed away. So let's go back and do a summary of Roger's life. So 1913, he's married in Hanover. 1915, he went bankrupt in Hanover. 1917, factory inspector in Harrisburg. In the Navy in Lewis in 1918. He moved to New York City in 1920, split up with Ava in 1926. Looks like from 1928 to 30, he was a sign painter in West Virginia rooming house. Then he was put up by his father in Hanover, Pennsylvania. 1933, he falls out of a New York City hotel. 34, he's living in a Miami hotel seeking veterans comp. In 1936, he dies in rural Erie, Pennsylvania. So pretty much from 1932 on, Roger had no fixed address. He was either in weekly lodging in Hanover, put up by his dad, or he's at a New York City hotel, Miami hotel in 1934, and rural Erie, Pennsylvania in 36. So again, my guess in the last years, 3 years of his life, Roger may have been seeking seasonal work in Miami during the winter and Erie during the summer. His family likely had no idea where he was. So what happened to Roger? So here's my guess about what happened to Roger. So Roger's life was going pretty well until he moved to New York City with Ava, and Roger arrived in New York City at the start of the Roaring Twenties. Now, this was the Prohibition era, and New York City had over 30,000 speakeasy bars in the 1920s. So probably one on every street corner or several on every street corner. And everybody was going to bars and everybody's getting drunk. And I think the temptation was just too much for Roger. After leaving New York, Roger was in and out of work, staying at rooming houses or hotels. So this was, again, remember, this is the 1930s. This is during the Great Depression. So it's likely that Roger was one of the many unemployed at the time. And it's estimated that there was an army of 2 million itinerant laborers who moved around the country seeking jobs. So Roger was part of a huge group of people that were in a similar position. So Roger was not unique in having troubles, but it was tough enough finding work at that time, but his drinking problem didn't help. Okay, so let's go back, with the information we have now and look at the family story and see how it holds up to reality. Because I actually think the family story is 100% accurate. So let's start with this. Whatever happened to Uncle Roger? He went to New York City and disappeared. Now, I'd originally thought this referred to Roger's first move to New York City in 1920, but it actually meant his trip in 1933. Now, remember, my father is the one telling the story to my mother, and he wasn't even born in 1920. So he would have had no idea that Roger had lived in New York City before. So when Roger was there in 1933, he could have had some negative experience, possibly a rejection by Ava. New York was still in Prohibition in 1933, so his old haunts would still be there. Roger fell into his comfortable routine of getting drunk to forget his troubles, and then he fell. So the last newspaper article, the one in Hanover, leaves us hanging with this dramatic scene. So McClellan Davidson is desperately trying to contact his son Roger, who's recuperating in Bellevue Hospital after his drunken binge and 9-story fall. So the family story tells us the answer. Roger disappeared. McClellan never got in touch with Roger. That was probably the last time his family knew where he was, when he was in Bellevue Hospital in New York. So let's look at the next part. The family tried to get in contact with Roger for years, but couldn't find out where he was or what happened to him. They really tried hard to find him. I'm sure they did. Carl and McClellan Davidson were smart, resourceful people who tried everything they could to find Roger without success. So after Roger left New York in 1933, he had no fixed address and he lived in various locations around the country. There would have been no way to contact him. Roger had well and truly disappeared. McClellan Davidson must have been very worried for his youngest son, Roger. I mean, he knew he had, basically a monkey on his back with this alcohol addiction. McClellan was a man that kept track of things. He maintained notebooks with detailed accounting records and kept his business running for half a century. So it must have been really frustrating for him not to be able to help and find his son, Roger. So again, here's the last part. He may have committed suicide, jumped out a hotel window. So again, the crazy part of the story is it's completely accurate. Roger did jump out a hotel window, and no doubt his family was concerned if Roger might take his own life, but he didn't. But that also raises the question of, why did Roger fall out of the hotel window? Did Roger intend to commit suicide? So thinking about this, it seems kind of unlikely for somebody to just fall out of a, 9-story hotel window by accident, even if you're blind drunk. I think it'd be kind of hard to do. So maybe Roger did jump, but that doesn't connect with Roger's remarks after they found him. He said, "I seem to have taken a fall. Whoopee." So that doesn't sound like somebody who was trying to commit suicide. It sounds like somebody with a really good sense of humor. So here's what I thought. Maybe Roger did intend to take his own life and changed his mind on the way down. Falling 9 stories and surviving would be enough to have most people re-examine their lives. Now here, when I went to visit Davidson Agency, they very nicely gave me the directions to go see the Davidson family plot in Hanover, PA, and here it is. Here's the burial ground. Now there's no mystery in the Davidson plot in Hanover, PA. Roger's tombstone is right there for anybody to see, which is right next to his father and mother's memorial. So anyone who visited the cemetery would see Roger. So why did my mother think that Roger disappeared off the face of the earth and nobody ever saw him again? So who knew what happened to Roger? So my mother wasn't told anything, but who did know and why keep it from everyone? So let's go through the family. So McClellan Davidson, obviously he knew everything. He put Roger up in the Hanover Hotel and he buried him in 1936. McClellan was the first person Roger called when he needed help, excuse me, like his hospital stay in 1928 and his plunge in 1933. He likely was Roger's point of contact throughout his life. So there is no mystery because the reports of Roger's death appeared in the local papers. Now, my grandfather had to know because he was the only surviving son. He would have arranged his father's funeral in 1951, and McClellan Davidson was buried right next to Roger's memorial. And Carl Davidson was actively involved in the Davidson Agency business in Hanover, so I'm sure he knew all about the backstory about Roger. And of course, again, Roger's death was reported in the local papers. Now, how about my father? He probably did not know. So my father was only 13 years old at the time of his Uncle Roger's death and living in York, Pennsylvania, some 20 miles away from Hanover. And if he knew, he definitely would have told my mother. So why was Roger's disappearance covered up? So, for a while I thought, oh, well, maybe it's business reputation. Both McClellan Davidson and Carl S. Davidson built companies that carry the Davidson name. Your reputation and trust are important to keep the businesses running. But, when you're thinking about it, that's not the reason because everybody knew Roger had died. It was reported in the York and Hanover papers. So making up a story about his mysterious disappearance would have just brought more attention to Roger, not less. So here's the origin of Roger's story. So my mother heard Roger's story from my father. Now, what 10-year-old boy wouldn't be fascinated by an uncle that went to New York and disappeared and jumped out a hotel window? So my father was still quite young when Uncle Roger passed, only 13 years old. So rather than get into an awkward family discussion about his uncle's drinking problems, it was easier just to call it a mystery. He just disappeared. The other thing I'm thinking is that, when his body was returned to Hanover, he was probably not a pretty sight because he had been, pretty much living outdoors for 3 years and, probably drinking quite a bit as well. So this was likely done out of respect for the deceased. I mean, why unnecessarily highlight Roger's troubles? So it was a family secret, but it was a secret only for my father. So why did Roger disappear? Roger's 9-story pledge from a New York City hotel in 1933 was a spectacular way to fall off the wagon. So that's when Roger disappeared. He was likely embarrassed to be so publicly humiliated and wanted to avoid seeing family. He might have felt he had failed his father and failed Ava. So what could Roger do? He's not going to go back to Hanover. They already tried that for 8 months and it didn't work. Why go back and cause his father more expense and grief? So Roger took off in 1933 at the height of the Great Depression, doing anything he could to keep afloat. Roger joined the army of 2 million unemployed and disappeared. Now, again, thinking about this, Roger's the last 3 years of Roger's life was really difficult. So he endured the hard life of a migrant laborer, sharing his fate with the poorest of society. So I was just doing some reading. So in Erie, Pennsylvania, there's like a three-tier level of workers. There were farm hands who would work regularly on farms. There were local people who would work seasonally. And then the bottom of the bottom were the transients that came in from out of town, and they would take whatever job was offered to them, and they would probably sleep under the stars. And that's what Roger was. I mean, he was from out of town, just showing up, asking for any kind of work he could get. So that was the life he was living. And towards the end, his health was failing, so much so that he died of an infected tooth. So Roger's living conditions were brutal. Each day was a struggle to survive. But Roger had a choice. He could have stopped any time and sent a message to his father, who was eager to help him. So why didn't Roger go back home? So I like to think this of Roger being undefeated. So Roger may have seen going back to Hanover as admitting defeat. So he had a failed marriage, he had a failed career, he'd lost his struggle against alcoholism. Going home would force Roger to admit that he couldn't even take care of himself. However well-meaning his family was, accepting their charity would be to lose face. So in a way, I see Roger's last 3 years as a kind of a triumph, a significant accomplishment that should be celebrated. Instead of giving up, Roger kept at it, enduring severe hardships as a migrant worker, fighting for day jobs and sleeping under the stars. His health and drinking problems made it even more difficult. Again, Roger could have stopped at any time, just one call or telegram to his father or brother, and the family would have sprung into action to save him. But he didn't because he wanted to live and die on his own 2 feet. So that's Roger. So what happened to Roger's wife, Ava? Well, let's check in on Ava. So remember, they divorced or they separated in 1926. She lived another 40 years on her own in New York City. And she was a lady from Little McSherrystown, Pennsylvania. So how did she do in the big city? So her obituary states that she was employed for many years at the Tailored Woman, Fifth Avenue, New York. And here's the Tailored Woman, very elegant place. So the Tailored Woman is a legendary New York women's specialty store that is located at 57th and 5th Avenue across from Tiffany's in what is now the Bergdorf Goodman building. So it's quite a journey for Ava Miller Davidson to go from Little McSherrystown, Pennsylvania, to long-term employment at the most exclusive and elegant retail shop in Manhattan. Now, here's a scene from Breakfast at Tiffany's, of all things. So the Tailored Woman can be seen in the background of this scene from the movie. The store was one of the most fashionable and expensive women's fashion shops in New York, which would be perfect for Holly Golightly. The store owner, Gene Denton, was a famous figure in New York City retailing and quite the outsized character. In addition to his high-end women's fashion business, he raised a herd of Aberdeen Angus cattle on his New Jersey farm. Now, there's a whole following online of people that used to be customers of the Tailored Woman or used to work at the Tailored Woman because it was really a fixture in New York for decades. And I corresponded with a descendant of the Tailored Woman owner, Gene Denton, who hosts a website devoted to the legacy of the store. So she was very gracious and she emailed back and she said that Denton was known to employ many beautiful and capable young women who tolerated his sometimes imperious temper. How lovely to think that your great aunt was one of them. Now, there's some more information about Ava during the 1930s when Roger was, unemployed and working as a migrant laborer. She went on a couple of cruises. She went on the Queen of Bermuda in 1934 and the Monarch of Bermuda in 1936. These were called millionaires' ships for their exclusive high society clientele. They were luxury cruises from New York City to Bermuda, operated by the Furnace Line from Great Britain. In fact, these cruises put Bermuda on the map as a luxury destination. So it's hard to imagine a husband and a wife having two more different lives. After 1933, you've got Roger on the left joining the army of itinerant unemployed, moving around the country to find work. Meanwhile, Ava lived a good life, mixing with the very cream of society in one of the most expensive retail shops in New York City. Ava Davidson not only dealt with high society at her job at the Tailored Woman, she vacationed with them too. So what can we say about Roger? Roger Bernie Davidson's life was a tragedy and ultimately unsuccessful struggle with alcohol addiction, but Roger did a number of things to admire. So he had ambition, and although his efforts ended in bankruptcy, Roger tried to build his own business. He married really well, and he took a big risk in going to New York City, a huge move for someone from a very small town in Pennsylvania. So it must have been very difficult for ambitious Roger to see his brother and his father create lasting businesses and his estranged wife have a successful career in New York while he's, not doing that well. So that may very well have contributed to his alcohol abuse. And, Roger lived a unique life. He participated in some of the great events of the early 20th century, experiencing the heights of the Roaring Twenties and the depths of the Great Depression. And, I kind of hate to say this, but, Roger probably had a great time partying in New York before alcoholism ruined his life. Um, you know, there's only one quote that we have from Lowell Thomas, and it shows that Roger had a great sense of humor. I mean, he was probably the life of the party. He probably, on the way up, Roger probably had a blast. On the way down, it was a nightmare, but, on the way down, on the way up, he hit the heights. And besides, how many people can say that they survived a 9-story fall from a Manhattan hotel and had the most popular radio broadcaster in the country tell his story to millions of listeners? So there we have it. That's Uncle Roger. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So
Awesome. Great work.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jay. That's kind of great. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Yeah, I just